Hi, everyone. It is just so great to be here, and right on cue, as always, the computer goes dark, but hopefully it'll come right back up. If you heard the topic of today's talk, freedom seekers who are escaping to Mexico, and thought, I've never heard of that before, don't worry, it's not because you weren't paying attention in Dr. Haas's US history course. I also did not know that enslaved people were escaping to anywhere other than the northern states or Canada or Haiti. And I really came across this subject by accident. I was doing research in northeastern Mexico on a different topic about violence on the US-Mexico border in the mid-19th century, and really trying to understand what violence looked like on the border right after it was delineated, but before either government had much control over that border. So I was looking in the archives for any sort of violent encounter, and I found a lot of what you might expect. So rustlers coming in and stealing livestock, indigenous people raiding on the border, but I also found a surprising number of documents about enslavers from the United States coming to Mexico, trying to kidnap fugitive slaves, and facing a lot of resistance from those fugitive slaves, and also from their Mexican neighbors and from Mexican officials. And I was really surprised by that, because I had no idea that enslaved people were escaping to Mexico, and I was really surprised that Mexican citizens and Mexican officials were sometimes risking their lives to help them to defend their claim to freedom in Mexico. And all during this research process, I kept thinking, this isn't what I'm working on. I'm working on something else. But those questions kept nagging at me. Why were enslaved people escaping to Mexico? And I eventually decided that I needed to dig a little bit deeper into that, and that digging a little bit deeper turned into, an 8-year-long process of writing this book, over the course of which I found out, or I learned, that Mexico had actually passed really radical anti-slavery laws, and that those laws had had profound consequences for enslaved people in the nearby states of Texas and Louisiana, but also at the very heart of the Union in those decades leading up to the US Civil War. Today, I want to explain the answers to 3 questions. The first, why Mexico abolished slavery. Second is how Mexican abolition contributed to the controversy over slavery in the United States. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how abolition, those anti-slavery laws in Mexico, shaped and were themselves shaped by the actions of enslaved people in the nearby states of Texas and Louisiana. In the process of answering these 3 questions, I hope to make a very simple argument: that we cannot understand the history of the United States without also understanding the history of Mexico and the important contributions that Mexico made to debates in the United States about slavery and freedom. So first, why did Mexico abolish slavery? We don't often think about Mexico as a place where slavery was really that important. But slavery actually was quite important to New Spain, as Mexico was known during the colonial period. As you can see on this chart of the enslaved population in New Spain between 1570 and 1810, there were actually a lot of enslaved people imported from Africa during the early colonial period. And in fact, between 1580 and 1640, New Spain imported more African slaves than any other viceroyalty in the Western Hemisphere except Brazil, a country that we really do think of as having a long history with slavery. But unlike Brazil, Mexico's enslaved population diminished, it decreased. And there are a lot of reasons why that was, and historians debate exactly when and why that happened. But suffice it to say that by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, there weren't as many enslaved people of African descent in New Spain. And by the time that Mexicans took up arms for their independence against Spain in 1810, enslaved people of African descent were estimated to number only about 9,000 to 10,000. So a pretty small population. Mexico's War of Independence, which was waged for 11 years until 1821, led to a surge in anti-slavery sentiment. And there were at least 3 factors to help us understand why there was this surge in anti-slavery sentiment as a result of this war for independence. The first was that the war against Spain had forged a link in the popular imagination between slavery and colonialism, individual emancipation, and national independence. And enslaved people themselves really reinforced this connection throughout the War of Independence and in the decade after by suing for their freedom in Mexican courts on the grounds that slavery could not exist in a newly independent republic. And in this respect, we see this surge in anti-slavery sentiment in Mexico paralleling some of the same trends we see in the wake of the American Revolution, where enslaved people are also making the argument in the United States that slavery cannot exist in a new republic. And we see changes being made at the state level to reflect that feeling that slavery really was incompatible with republicanism. But there are some other reasons why anti-slavery particularly took root in Mexico during this time. And that second reason is that anti-slavery helped to differentiate Mexico from Spain, the country that had previously claimed ownership and sovereignty over Mexico. And this was this sort of task of differentiating a new nation from the nation it had, or the empire that it had once been a part of. It was important across this revolutionary period. And Spain had, of course, continued to allow slavery in its remaining colonial possessions in places like Cuba. And by making inroads against slavery, Mexico sought to cast itself in a different and more enlightened mold, that they were different from Spain, that they were better than Spain, that their independence movement was justified and a positive development. The third reason that we see a rise of anti-slavery in Mexico is that Mexico was also trying to distinguish itself from its neighbor to the north, and that would be us. Mexican politicians predicted that Americans' revolution against Britain would be forgotten because of the contradiction between those great ideals of liberty and equality and the reality of millions of enslaved people being held in bondage in the United States. Mexican politicians promised that their independence movement would make good on that rhetoric of liberty and equality. This anti-slavery sentiment manifested itself most clearly on the state level. And I have to apologize, I am not very good at map making. So these are the contemporary boundaries of Mexican states, not the 19th century boundaries. But I hope they'll at least give you some sense of the sort of regional dimensions of these state level anti-slavery laws. So between 1821, when Mexico won its independence, and 1827, 7 of Mexico's 19 states abolished slavery outright. 9 also decreed that children born of enslaved people would be freed, what were known as free womb laws. And these gradual emancipation laws didn't end slavery, they didn't abolish slavery. But like those gradual emancipation laws that you might have heard about in states like Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, they did hold out the promise that slavery would eventually come to an end within a generation or two. So like the United States, which in the wake of the American Revolution was also seeing a surge in anti-slavery sentiment and a surge in state-level gradual emancipation laws and abolition decrees, the same thing is happening in Mexico. The national government in Mexico was also making inroads against slavery. In 1821, the Mexican government abolished all distinctions of race and caste, which actually was a pretty important change to be made given the very complex system of castes that had developed during the colonial period in New Spain, which you can see depicted here this is known as a casta painting, which depicts 16 different racial categories of people in Mexico, depending on their relative descendant from Spaniards, from indigenous people, or from people of African descent. So there was this complex racial classification system that was just abolished. Now, it's very important to underscore that this did not actually abolish racism in Mexico by any stretch of the imagination. But it did mean that in all official documentation, in censuses, in tax records, that nothing was written down about someone's race. That stands in marked contrast to what was happening in the United States, where that was marked down constantly. In addition to abolishing all distinctions of race and caste and trying to create this idea of Mexicans as being one nation, one people, the Mexican government also in 1824 banned the importation of enslaved people to Mexico. And oftentimes when we're thinking about the history of slavery, the bans on importation are something that we don't really pay all that much attention to because it's not actually abolishing slavery outright. But this law was actually quite important in a way that similar laws banning the importation of enslaved people, like the one passed in 1808 in the United States, were not. So the United States had passed this law against the importation of enslaved people in 1808 at a time when its enslaved population numbered about 1 million. And as a result of that large number of enslaved people and a variety of other factors that historians debate, that enslaved population was able to not just maintain itself, but grow without that importation of enslaved people. But if you remember that earlier graph about the enslaved population in Mexico, it was much smaller, 9,000 to 10,000 people. That was a population that seemed unlikely to be able to maintain its numbers without having further importation of enslaved people. So this law actually, by cutting off the supply of enslaved people from Africa, seemed to bode the end of slavery in Mexico. Another component of this law, which if you read Spanish you might be able to see here, is that it actually explicitly promised liberty to enslaved people who were illegally imported from the moment they set foot on Mexican soil. And that provision is going to be pretty important for what comes next, so keep it in the back of your mind. And it stood in marked contrast again to that US law in 1808, which said that when enslaved people were imported illegally, that they would just be given up to the state government to decide what to do with. And most of the time, southern states auctioned off those illegally imported slaves. They remained in slavery. So the national government is making inroads against slavery, but it did not abolish slavery outright. And that might sound pretty surprising given what we know about the enslaved population of Mexico. We know that it was declining in number. So why is it that the Mexican government stopped short of total emancipation? And the reason for that, I think, has to do with the fact that while the enslaved population of Mexico was declining at a national level, it remained important regionally. Particularly in the slaveholding, or the sugar-producing South and the cotton-growing North. And I'll say here that there are historians that debate the extent of slavery in southern Mexico at this point. But there's no dispute whatsoever about the growing importance of slavery in what was then the Mexican province of Texas and what is now the American state of Texas. There were a growing number of Anglo-American colonists who were immigrating to the Mexican province of Texas starting in the 1820s and really accelerating in the 1830s. Many of them came from the southern states, and many of them brought enslaved people with them, in violation of that 1824 law banning the importation of enslaved people. As a result of these two regions seeming to depend on slavery, the Mexican government recognized that abolishing slavery outright might cause these far-flung regions to revolt against any provision that would abolish slavery. And that fear, that prediction that these regions would not be happy about abolition proved true on September 16th, 1829, when Mexico's President Vicente Guerrero, himself of African descent, abolished slavery by executive decree. The outcry against this law was immediate. Enslavers in Chiapas, which is highlighted in its current boundaries there, demanded compensation for their emancipated property. The town council of Córdoba, Veracruz, warned that the decree, quote, would cause the ruin of this population that labors exclusively in the cane fields. Meanwhile, Yucatan seceded from the Mexican Federation, and there's a lot of reasons why Yucatan seceded during this time. But one of the reasons that the Yucatan government pointed to was the abolition of slavery, which they called, quote, a cruel attack on property, close quote, that disadvantaged Yucatan more than any other state. Of course, the Mexican province of Texas, with all of those Anglo-American colonists who had brought their enslaved people with them, begged to differ with those legislators in Yucatan. They believed that they were the most disadvantaged, and they were supported by elite Tejanos in the Mexican province of Texas who were sort of bound up in commercial relationships with many of those Anglo-American colonists. The threat of a revolt in Texas that might have been spearheaded by those elite Tejanos and by those Anglo-American colonists was so great that President Guerrero actually exempted the decree or the province from his decree 2 months after issuing it. So he said, it's not going to apply to Texas. All of these protests against that executive decree abolishing slavery ultimately had their intended effect. They convinced the Mexican government that they could not abolish slavery. And in 1831, Mexico's Congress abrogated, they overturned all of the laws that Guerrero had passed during this particular time, including the decree abolishing slavery. And the fact that the Mexican government had sort of walked away from that abolition decree might lead us to believe that they weren't really that committed to anti-slavery. But actually this experience, this resistance against the anti-slavery law, in many respects underscored the need to eliminate slavery, albeit more slowly. Rebellious enslavers posed a threat to national sovereignty, and as a result, at both the state and national level, the Mexican authorities redoubled their efforts to enforce those existing gradual emancipation laws in order to slowly bring slavery to an end and to sort of remove that threat to the national sovereignty. So how did the Mexican government actually do that? The first thing they did was they passed the law of April 6, 1830, which is perhaps most famous for having prohibited the further immigration of Anglo-American colonists from the United States. But it also recommitted the Mexican government to actually enforcing that ban on the importation of enslaved people. It said, we're really gonna say no more enslaved people can come from anywhere else, and those who do come have a right to freedom under that 1824 law. The Anglo-American colonists really tried to circumvent this law, and the way that they did this is something that you might be familiar from your US history classes. They basically forced enslaved people to sign indenture contracts that would last their entire lifetime, so 70, 80, 90-year contracts. And so they just disguised enslaved people as indentured servants. In response to that, the legislature of Coahuila y Texas, which was the state of which the Mexican province of Texas was a part, passed a law that limited the terms of any indenture contract to 10 years, annulling those lifelong indenture contracts that enslavers had forced their enslaved people to sign. So we're seeing this dance between the Mexican government trying to enforce these laws and the Anglo-American colonists from Texas trying to evade them and avoid them. This was not, of course, what Anglo-American colonists wanted when they moved to Texas. They did not think that they were moving to a place that had gradual emancipation laws like they had in New York or Pennsylvania. They were not pleased, even in the 1830s, about what was happening. And things only got worse in 1834 when Mexico's vice president dispatched a secret agent to Texas with instructions, which you can see here, to seek by every possible and prudent means to make it known to the slaves who had been brought into the Republic in circumvention of the law, this is that 1824 law again, that the law gives them freedom by the mere act of stepping on the territory of the Republic. This was for many the last straw. The Anglo colonists in Texas concluded what they had long suspected, that their rights would just never be safe under Mexican rule. And their ability to circumvent anti-slavery legislation coming from Mexico City was further diminished when President Antonio López de Santa Anna overturned Mexico's federalist constitution in favor of a more centralist system, a system in which a governor would be appointed by Mexico City that wouldn't really be quite as susceptible to the demands of those Anglo-American colonists. In the fall of 1835, the Anglo-colonists in Texas revolted. Originally, they were revolting just against this move to centralism, but by 1836, they made clear that they actually were declaring independence, and they won that independence on April 21st, 1836, when Texas forces defeated the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto, securing the independence of Texas. Less than a year later, in 1837, Mexico's Congress voted to abolish slavery without exception. And here you can see the announcement of that abolition law in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in the United States. And the timing here was really no coincidence. Defending liberty acted on popular anti-slavery sentiment in Mexico, which we know had surged in the wake of Mexico's independence movement, and was reflected in the popularity of plays like La Cabaña del Tío Tomás, which I think even if you don't speak Spanish, you might be able to understand as a play version in Spanish of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was a hugely popular play in Mexico and actually throughout Latin America. And by abolishing slavery, Mexico is sort of acting on that popular sentiment. Abolition also helped to galvanize international support for Mexico. Abolitionists in the United States and Great Britain had denounced the Texas Revolution as a slaveholders' rebellion, and the abolition of slavery in Mexico seemed to confirm this interpretation. From Edinburgh, Scotland to Westchester, New York, anti-slavery societies condemned Texas for having exercised its political liberty in defense of slavery. And we can see that so clearly in this broadside that shows the free eagle of Mexico grappling with the cold-blooded viper tyranny or Texas. So this is really playing into this idea of slaveholding Texas against the sort of liberty-loving Mexico. But the abolition of slavery also seemed to serve a larger political purpose. As the news of Mexico's abolition policies spread, white Texans complained that their enslaved people displayed, quote, a very refractory disposition, close quote. And they blamed the Mexican government, as you can see in this article from the Telegraph and Texas Register, of sending emissaries, quote, to excite an insurrection. And there's no hard evidence that the Mexican government was sending emissaries, but they had done that in 1834, so it's not beyond the scope of possibility here. But regardless of whether they were sending emissaries or not, the promise of freedom in Mexico was potentially destabilizing to the Republic of Texas, which was trying to sort of assert and defend its independence in the wake of winning it militarily from Mexico. For by revolt or escape, enslaved people really had the power to undermine and cause instability in that fledgling republic at the very moment when it most needed to sort of prove itself before the community of nations. So Mexico's anti-slavery laws, in other words, were a powerful weapon in the hands of a weak government. They weren't overtly belligerent. The northern states and Canada had also abolished slavery. But these policies boosted morale, they attracted international support, and they had the potential to recruit military allies. They were, in the words of one Mexican diplomat, quote, the rock that could shatter the clay foot of the giant. So, more than you ever thought you might get about the origins of Mexico's anti-slavery laws. But what exactly were the consequences of those anti-slavery laws to what was going on in the United States? Historians have done a lot of work in the past couple of decades showing how the anti-slavery laws in the northern states, in the British Empire, in Haiti, had destabilized slavery in the southern states, both by attracting enslaved people to escape and also by suggesting to enslavers in the South that they were under siege. Now think about what happens if Mexico abolishes slavery. In contrast to Haiti, which lays 500 miles by sea from the southernmost tip of Florida, In contrast to Canada, which required crossing all of the northern states to get to, Mexico directly bordered the US South, and not just any part of the US South, the cotton-growing South, Texas, Louisiana, where slavery was really booming. So anti-slavery in Mexico posed a pretty big threat to slavery in the United States, but it would take a while for the consequences of that to really become apparent. Mexican abolition did not undermine the independence of the Republic of Texas. In fact, in 1845, as many of you may know, the US Congress had voted by joint resolution to annex the Republic of Texas. And less than a year later, the US Army had sort of provoked a war with Mexico, starting in 1846, the famous US war with Mexico that ended in 1848, 2 years later. The US president at the time was James K. Polk, and he made clear that he intended to pay for the war with Mexico by seizing Mexico's northern territories. As some northern commentators like to sort of complain, Polk wanted Mexico to pay for its own a war against it. And the war ended with the conquest of what is now the American Southwest. It was half of Mexico's territory if you include Texas. And it marked the first time in US history that the United States had conquered territories where slavery had been explicitly abolished. And that really posed a problem, because up until that point, the United States had expanded from those 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific, and the Congress had kind of divvied up the colony or the territories between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. You might be familiar with the Mason-Dixon line, the Ohio River, 3630. Those were the dividing lines in the United States between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. And the idea was that south of those lines would be open to slavery. Southern politicians, as a result, expected this territory, which was in the southern part of the United States, to be open to slavery. But this time, northern politicians of all political persuasions refused to reestablish slavery where it had been explicitly abolished. Some of them believed it was immoral, but many more believed that the Constitution simply didn't authorize them to reestablish slavery where it had been abolished. They were sort of strict constructionists of the Constitution and thought that it wouldn't work. So imagine for a moment that Republicans and Democrats today came together over something along sectional lines. That was pretty much what was happening there, that these two polarized political parties were coming together against the idea of reestablishing slavery in these areas. And as a result of that coalition of Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs, which was the other party during this time, they couldn't just keep that dividing line going all the way to the Pacific. Instead, they came up with this idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that people in the territories would be able to decide whether or not to allow slavery or not. And that concept really destabilized, it did not work very well for reasons that I don't have time to get into. But it really caused Southern politicians to be extremely worried, because at the time that the US-Mexico War ended, the number of slave states and non-slave-holding states were equal. There were 15 slave states and 15 free states. But once it was up in the air whether or not the American Southwest would be open to slavery or not, this was the fear. This was the fear of Southern politicians, that all of those remaining territories in the Northwest and the Southwest would be closed to slavery, and that the sectional balance, the balance between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states in the federal government, particularly at the Senate, where each state gets to send two senators, that would be tilted in balance or in favor of the non-slaveholding states, and that those non-slaveholding states would be able to pass anti-slavery legislation. Southern politicians really did not want this to happen, and as a result of that, they tried to annex Cuba, which would presumably enter the United States as a slave state. They tried to overturn the Missouri Compromise line, which had prohibited slavery north of that green line in Louisiana Purchase. They led to the outbreak of violence in Kansas as people fought out whether or not Kansas would become a slaveholding or a non-slaveholding state. And it eventually led to the birth of a new political party, the Republican Party, whose success in the election of 1860 led to the outbreak or the secession of the southern states. I know I'm covering a lot of ground here, but I am happy to sort of clarify anything that might not be clear in this brief discussion of how Mexico's anti-slavery laws contributed to sectional controversy in the United States. If the abolition of slavery in Mexico had important consequences for the future of slavery in the US, it had even more profound consequences for the growing population of enslaved people being forced to labor on sugar and cotton plantations in Texas and Louisiana. As you can see from this map from 1860, which calculated the number of enslaved people in each county in the United States, you can see that there's quite a density of enslaved people in eastern Texas and in the Mississippi Valley here. And for those enslaved people, as I mentioned earlier, making it to Mexico was a lot more feasible in many respects than trying to go up north to the northern states, where they were still subject to being kidnapped by slave catchers. If you remember, the Constitution had a fugitive slave clause which mandated that fugitive slaves could be returned to their owners as long as they were still within the confines of the United States, even if they were in a non-slaveholding state. So we see enslaved people escaping to Mexico. They were escaping before Mexico abolished slavery, but it accelerated considerably in the wake of Mexican abolition, and particularly in the 1850s. But what happened to those enslaved people who escaped to Mexico? There were really one of two options that most of them seemed to follow. And the first option was to join Mexico's military colonies, which was a series of outposts on Mexico's northern frontier, which helped to defend Mexico's boundaries, their borders, from filibusters from the United States, invaders who were trying to come in and do bad things to Mexico, as well as from indigenous people who were come in to raid northern Mexican ranches. And you can see those, it's a little hard to see here, but those red dots on that map are where the military colonies were. And most enslaved people escaped to one military colony in particular. And it was this one, well, we'll get to that in just a second, but it was in the northeastern Mexican state of Coahuila. And this came about through sort of a complex history. In 1850, several hundred Seminole Indians moved from the United States and Indian Territory to this military colony, which a contemporary picture you can see here. 84 of those original 351 immigrants were of African descent. They were formerly enslaved people who had allied with the Seminole Indians, and they were known as the Mascogos, or the Black Seminole. Fugitive slaves soon escaped to join them. In 1851, 356 people of African descent lived at this particular military colony, which was more than 4 times the number that had arrived with the Seminole the previous year. And there are many reasons why we can account for that increase in the number of enslaved people in the military colony between 1850 and 1851. We know that there were more Black Seminole who came during that time from Indian Territory, but there's evidence to suggest that at least a portion of that increase was from enslaved people who were escaping to join this community in northeastern Mexico. Life in Mexico at this military colony was not easy. Few fugitive slaves spoke Spanish. Most arrived with little more than the clothes on their back. But the Mexican government actually gave the military colony 370 pesos a month to help get those new inhabitants to work growing corn, raising stock, building wood frame houses around a square where they kept their animals at night. In Mexico, as in the United States, military service provided a route to freedom. Of course, it came at a cost. It required leaving at a moment's notice in order to take up arms against any potential invader. But these enslaved people, Black Seminole and Seminole Indians, quickly earned the respect of Mexican authorities. In 1851, a high-ranking Mexican official who governed Mexico's military colonies reported that the Black Seminole never abandoned, quote, the desire to succeed in punishing the enemy, close quote. The victories that the Black Seminole and the fugitive slaves helped score against the Comanches and Apaches proved to Mexican military commanders that they were, quote, worthy of every confidence. So for all of its restrictions, military service had another benefit besides sort of earning the respect of Mexican officials. It also helped freedom seekers to defend themselves against those who wished to return them to slavery. And I'll just give one brief example of how that worked. On September 20th, 1851, Sheriff John Crawford of Bexar County, Texas, rode 200 miles from San Antonio to that Mexican military colony, which you can see pointed out by that red arrow there. It was right near the town of Guerrero, Coahuila. There, the sheriff arrested 2 men he suspected of being freedom seekers, fugitive slaves, and he carried them back across the Rio Grande. Jose Antonio de Arredondo, a justice of the peace in Guerrero, immediately protested this, insisting that the 2 men were, quote, under the protection of our laws and government and considered as Mexican citizens. Considered as Mexican citizens is quite a remarkable thing, again, given what's happening in the United States in the 1850s, where people of African descent were denied the right to citizenship in that 1857 Supreme Court case, Dred Scott. When US officials responded to this by saying that a court in San Antonio had ordered the arrest of these fugitive slaves, the sub-inspector of Mexico's eastern military colonies demanded nonetheless that they be released. These diplomatic negotiations didn't seem to be working, and so a force of Black and Seminole people actually took up arms, attempted to cross the Rio Grande, and to free the prisoners by force. And we can't know for sure, but it probably was easier to do that when you already had guns and some military experience through those military colonies. So though military service helped to ensure the freedom of former slaves, that freedom, of course, came at a cost. They had to risk their lives in the heat of battle, and they also had to participate, it's important to say, in Mexico's often brutal campaign against Comanches and Apaches who were coming down from the United States and raiding Mexican ranches. And so for all of these advantages, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that not all fugitive slaves took this route. The other option was to settle in cities, like this one, Reynosa, Tamaulipas, which in northeastern Mexico often had growing populations of people of African descent who were coming from places as far afield as Haiti, the British Caribbean, and the United States. Those who came to cities were often able to hire themselves out in households, working as blacksmiths, as barbers, that sort of thing. And enslaved people, for freedom seekers, could also find work in more rural situations. They could hire themselves out to local landowners who were in constant need of extra hands on their ranches and haciendas. Like the freedom seekers who joined Mexico's military colonies, those who found work in northern Mexico also faced the threat of kidnapping by their former enslavers. And again, I'll just give a couple of brief stories about what their experiences were like trying to defend their freedom against these kidnappers. On August 20th, 1850, Manuel Luis del Fierro stepped outside of his house in Reynosa, Tamaulipas. So this is a later photo, but it gives you some sense of what that town looked like, just across the border from McAllen, Texas. And the night was hot, and a band was playing in this very plaza. As he stood listening, his house was near the plaza, 2 foreigners approached him asking if he wanted to join them at the concert. Del Fierro had politely refused their invitation and really didn't give the incident much thought until he woke later that night to the sound of a woman screaming. Del Fierro hurried towards the commotion, and in one of the rooms of the house, he came across those same 2 foreigners who had invited him to the concert. One was waving a pistol at his maid, Matilde Genes, who he later testified, quote, had been held as a slave in the United States. Genes had belonged to an enslaver named William Cheney, who owned a plantation near Cheneyville, Louisiana. That's that second arrow up there, which was a town about 150 miles northwest of New Orleans. And the fact that she came from there is somewhat fortuitous for us because that wasn't so far from where Solomon Northup, a free Black man who was kidnapped from the north and sold into slavery, was also sold into slavery. He was enslaved at a neighboring plantation. And in the memoir that he wrote, 12 Years a Slave, he talked about hearing of several enslaved people who had been hanged in that area for planning, quote, a crusade to Mexico. As Northup recalled in his memoir, the plot was, quote, a subject of general and unfailing interest in every slave hut on the bayou, close quote. So from that information, we have some evidence to suggest that from her years working on Cheney's plantation, Matilde Genes might have known that Mexico's laws would give her a claim to freedom. And at some point, although when or how is unclear, Genes acted on that knowledge, escaping from Cheneyville, making her way to Reynosa, and finding work in Manuel Luis del Fierro's household. And in that moment, on that August night, with a man waving a pistol in her face, while she's screaming and trying to get him to stop, Manuel Luis del Fierro was faced with a choice. He could do nothing, or he could do something to help her. And it seemed that Del Fierro considered Matilde Genes as more than just a runaway. He seemed to consider her as a member of his household to whom he had some obligation to help her. And in that room where he came across those two men threatening her with a pistol, Del Fierro took up his gun and threatened to shoot unless they stopped. His wife called for help from the balcony, and one of the kidnappers was actually arrested as a result of their everyone's efforts to resist them. And the person who was arrested turned out to be none other than Genes's former owner, William Cheney. In Mexico, Cheney found that he could not treat people of African descent with impunity, as enslavers often did in the United States. Remember that it was perfectly legal in the United States under the Fugitive Slave Act for enslavers to kidnap fugitive slaves. While Cheney sat in prison, Judge Justo Trevino of the District of Northern Tamaulipas began an investigation into that attempted kidnapping. And we know that he was there for at least a month. At that point, the archival trail runs dry. But this gives us some sense that he was held accountable in Mexico in ways that he never would have in the United States. And Del Fierro's actions were really not at all unusual. In 1851, the townspeople of a small village in northern Coahuila took up arms to stop a slave catcher named Warren Adams from kidnapping an entire family of Negroes, close quote. Later that year, the Mexican army posted a large force and 2 artillery pieces on the Rio Grande to stop a group of 200 Americans from crossing the river, likely to seize fugitive slaves. In 1851, and this is my favorite archival find of all, 4 townspeople from Guerrero, Coahuila, chased after an enslaver from the United States who had kidnapped a black man from their colony. They found the enslaver, who pulled out a 6-shooter, but one of those 4 townspeople drew faster, and they killed him. Unable to bring the kidnapper to court, the 4 townspeople instead brought his corpse to the judge in Guerrero, who certified that the man was in fact dead, quote, for not having responded when spoken to, and other cadaverous signs, close quote. The protection that Mexican citizens helped to provide to enslaved people, the resistance of freedom seekers to being kidnapped, that was all significant because it helped to give meaning to Mexico's anti-slavery laws. And as a result of that meaning, it undermined slavery in the United States. And I think that there's no better document to encapsulate that than this census from Brownsville, Texas in 1860. Now, Brownsville, Texas is right on the Rio Grande. And so it maybe is not entirely surprising that even though Brownsville is in a slave state, Texas, there are only 7 enslaved people who are listed on the census. And of course, they're listed by the names of their enslavers, not by their own names. But 7 people, not very much for a bustling town. And that shows, I think, the fear that enslavers had and that they wrote down. They said that they were afraid of bringing enslaved people anywhere near Mexico for fear that they would escape. And that fear was very well justified, and you can see that on the census, because here in column 6, it says fugitives from the state. 4 of those 7 enslaved people, ostensibly in Brownsville, Texas, were fugitives from the state. We don't know where they were fugitives to, but given the proximity to Mexico, it's a good chance that at least some, if not all of them, had escaped to Mexico. So what do we make of all this? Mexico has often served as a foil to the United States. In the first half of the 19th century, the population of the United States doubled and then doubled again. Its territory expanded by the same proportion as its leaders purchased, conquered, and expropriated lands to the west and south. Mexico, meanwhile, was so unstable that the country went through 49 presidencies between 1824 and 1857. And yet, enslaved people left the United States for Mexico. It's certainly true that the promise of freedom in Mexico was imperfect. For freedom seekers who joined Mexico's military colonies, the cost of their freedom was participation in Mexico's campaign against indigenous people. For those who found work in northern Mexico, the threat of kidnapping remained an ever-present fear. Despite these limitations, the enslaved people who escaped from the United States and the Mexican citizens who protected them ensured that the promise of freedom in Mexico was significant, even if it was incomplete. Only by abolishing human bondage was it possible to extend the debate over the full meaning of universal freedom. As the poet Walt Whitman put it, quote, "It is provided in the essence of things that from any fruition of success, no matter what, shall come forth something to make a greater struggle necessary," close quote. Their work, our work, isn't over. Thank you. And I think now we have some time for any questions. And I think the two microphones up at the top.
All right, if I could say something.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the presentation. As I was watching you finish up, you looked a little parched, and I think I've been remiss in my duties. I bought you a coffee, but I didn't think to bring you a water out there, so I hope you're still hanging in there. One thing that I would like to say, I'm very appreciative of you coming out here. I'm very appreciative of my colleagues and all the students that came out. This is some of the creme de la creme here at the school. I'd also like to thank David Ward and his crew in the back. That people don't know, they've been here for hours before the presentation, getting everything together to make this all happen. I watched Dave about 3 weeks ago. I spoke to Indians, people from India, not Native Americans, and he was getting all kinds of requests thrown at him, and he was handling it very well. And I also want to give a shout out to Sarah Pearl, who was here a good couple hours before the presentation for the interview that we did up in front, the camera work, doing all of that stuff. If we can give a round of applause for them. It would not happen. And then I will be quiet here to say we have the mics up here. The reason we have the mics up here, even if we can hear you, this is being recorded. It won't be on recording. So if you have some questions that you would like to ask, if you could come up to the two mics and ask your questions, and we'll try to get in as many as we possibly can. All right, so remember that the idea is to ask questions, not to tell your life story.
And what Dr. Haas just said made me realize with great shame that I forgot to give my own thank yous, which thank you to Dr. Haas for inviting me, and to everyone for making this possible, and for all of you in the audience for coming today. It's actually my birthday today, and there's no better gift than to have all of you here. Great.
Hello, I'm Walter from History Department. Pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming. I had a question. Could you discuss the role of the Tejanos, the Tejano elite, perhaps in relation to Mexico's abolitionist laws and in relation to the Texas annexation, please?
Absolutely, and Walter, it's so nice to meet in person, and it's a great question, and it's one that I highly recommend Andrew Torgett's book, Seeds of Empire. I know for students in the room, you're probably like, oh, I don't want to read another book, but it's a great book that talks a lot about the involvement of Tejanos in the question of slavery. And it's a complicated history. It's one in which I described some of the sort of anti-slavery sentiment in Mexico, and for many Tejanos, particularly elite Tejanos, they were kind of going against that anti-slavery sentiment in Mexico. So why would that be? Tejano, or Tejas, in the wake of Mexico's War of Independence, was poor. It was subject to a lot of indigenous raiding, and that was part of the reason why the Mexican government wanted colonists to come in from the United States to help populate Mexican Texas and to sort of jumpstart the economy. As a result of that immigration of Anglo-American colonists to the Mexican province of Texas, elite Tejanos, mostly who were in San Antonio, were starting to benefit from the trade that was made possible by this new immigration. That now there were this trade network that was connecting San Antonio to places like New Orleans that hadn't really existed before. And Andrew Torgott's book details the ways in which that commercial connection led particularly elite Tejanos to sort of be willing to support the Anglo-American colonists in their, machinations to try to protect slavery. And in the early days of the Texas Revolution, there were a number of Tejanos who joined with the Anglo-American colonists in that revolt against federalism. As I mentioned, it started out as a revolt against, or not against centralism. It started out not as a war for independence, but as a war to defend this federal structure in Mexico. It's noteworthy, though, that when the war became about independence, that many of those Tejano leaders actually left the movement, that they no longer were interested in being part of it. And so there's this way in which Tejanos sometimes were supporting the pro-slavery interests of Anglo-American colonists, but there was a limit to that. And that limit really became clear once the Anglo-American colonists made clear that they were fighting for their own independence, not to remain within Mexico. So thank you.
You want to take advantage of this opportunity here. It won't be long and then it'll be gone.
Hi, I'm Grant. I'm a student here at Cerritos College. And you might not have the answer to this question, but you talk about the history of Mexico sort of helping American slaves. Why do you think that this topic is not really ever taught to students like in high school and even now in college?
Thank you so much for that question, Graham. It actually, I think it's one of the questions that most blew my mind when I was working on this book. Like, we hear so much about Harriet Tubman, as we should. We hear so much about the escape of enslaved people to the northern states and to Canada, but like, why is this particular history overlooked so much? And there are a couple of different reasons why I think that might be, although I'll add the caveat that it's hard to know exactly for sure. But one reason is that this emphasis and mythologization of the Northern Underground Railroad started in the late 19th century, in the 1870s, when a historian named Wilbur Siebert did interviews with people, white people generally, in the northern states who claimed to have been conductors on the Underground Railroad. And that research and that story of the Underground Railroad was really made Americans feel good about themselves, because even though there was this history of slavery in the United States that we had fought a civil war over, the Underground Railroad to the north seemed to suggest that, well, there were white people in the United States who were against slavery, who were protecting enslaved people, who were helping them move to places where they could be free, or at least more free. And so this narrative of the Underground Railroad was a narrative that helped to sort of bring the North and the South together to make white Americans feel good about themselves. Of course, historians since then have shown that actually, it was people of African descent who were doing a lot of the work of the Underground Railroad, that it was a lot smaller in number than Wilbur Siebert originally suggested. So there are all these ways in which I think that part of the reason is just this long-standing interest in the northbound Underground Railroad, which is also very important. But perhaps not quite to the same extent that the original promoters of it suggested. So that might be one reason, that there's something that we really like about the northbound Underground Railroad. And another reason, which is related to that, is that I think we often, as people in the United States reading the newspaper, most of what we hear about Mexico is corruption, violence, instability, drug war, immigration. It's all negative stuff. And I think that it makes it, and I saw this also in some of the reactions to my research when I was working on the book and even now, where sometimes it seems like it's really hard to sometimes even think that the Mexican government, that Mexican citizens could have had a part of their history that was something other than those things. So that might be another reason. And then the final thing is the more boring practical reason, which is you need to write. I started off as a Latin American historian. I started off in Mexican archives. And I think that starting there really showed me that there was a lot of sources in Mexican archives to help tell this story. There were other people, other earlier historians who tried to write this, but started in Texas archives and didn't really find very much. And so I got a lot of advice when I was working on this from historians based in Texas who were like, this is a dead end, it's not gonna go anywhere, I've tried, there's nothing there. So that might also be part of it, that you really need to be doing research on both sides of the border, and particularly in Mexican archives, which a lot of US historians really weren't doing until probably the 90s or so. So those are my best guesses, but I hope it's changing. I hope it will change. So thank you, Graham.
Hello, my name is Joelle Francos, and I would like to ask, once slaves would become Mexican citizens, what were their lives like once they became Mexican citizens?
Yeah, that's also a really great question, and it's one that is really hard to answer because of that 1821 law that I mentioned that abolished all distinctions of caste and race in Mexico. So many of those official records that, for those of you who maybe do genealogy, that you use a lot, Ancestry.com, to trace your relatives, those aren't really as available in Mexico. It's hard to look at a census, or it's impossible to look at a census and even determine whether someone was of African descent or not. So it's hard to trace enslaved people once they escape to Mexico. It's easier with those who joined the military colony because there's all of these sources about that particular military colony. So in short, we have little bits of information here and there about what their lives were like. It seemed like the ones who joined the military colony were able to claim land. They exercised the rights of citizenship. We have evidence that at least one of those enslaved people who joined that military colony became a justice of the peace, which was something that was reserved for citizens. And the descendants of the Black Seminole and the fugitive slaves who joined them actually still live in this community, not all of them, but there is still a community in northeastern Mexico. That's what that contemporary photo was. So we have a better sense of what their lives were like. They learned Spanish, they intermarried with Mexicans who lived in the nearby town of Guerrero. It's a lot harder to find what happened to the people who who worked. People like Matilde Genes, we have some sense of what life was like for them when they come up in the records because they were, nearly kidnapped. But it's a lot harder to find what happened to them. And I found that very frustrating when I was working on this research. I was like, why can't I find anything about them? And then I realized that actually was a good thing. It was a good thing that I couldn't find anything about them because that was what they wanted. They wanted to not be found by their enslavers and also by me. The same things that would have helped their enslavers find them were the same things that would help historians find them. And so as frustrated as it was, and as hard as it made it to tell the story, and as frustrating it is to not really be able to answer your question, I actually think that it maybe is a testament to the courage and tenacity of these freedom seekers, that they actually succeeded in erasing their past as enslaved people in Mexico. And I think it gives us maybe some sense of the integration that they managed to have in Mexican society. So thank you.
Other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm a student of Dr. Haas, and I'd like to know if you could illustrate or give us a size of magnitude and popularity in this purported runaway situation. Like, was it known throughout the U.S.? Was it a popular movement, or was it just localized and only known to individuals that pertain to the Texas regions or nearby regions?
That's a really great question. So how familiar were people with the promise of freedom in Mexico? And I was really surprised to find that Mexico was associated as a place of freedom in the 19th century in ways that it is not now. So in many slaveholding states, there were requirements that if you manumitted, if you freed an enslaved, if an enslaver freed an enslaved person, that they would have to provide for their removal somewhere where they were slaveholding, or where they would have to remove them from the slaveholding state. And there are actual manumission records in states like South Carolina in which enslavers are sending their manumitted enslaved people to Mexico. And they're saying, this is a place where they can be free. So pretty incredible that idea of Mexico being a place where slavery had been abolished, reached all the way to enslavers on the sort of eastern seaboard. It was also, I'm surprised to know, maybe not common knowledge, but it was openly discussed on the floor of the US Senate, that in the midst of those debates in the wake of the US-Mexico War about what to do with those slaveholding territories, that Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who was a senator from Missouri, a slave state, actually read Mexico's laws in the original Spanish on the floor of the Senate in order to show that, like, no, indeed, Mexico had abolished slavery and, like, we can't reestablish it. So pretty incredible coverage. And abolitionists themselves are also aware of Mexico as this place where perhaps freedom could be had. That Benjamin Lundy, who was one of, is a famous abolitionist mostly in the sort of 1830s, 1840s, he actually went to Mexico and tried to establish a colony for free African Americans in Mexico. So there is, it's so interesting, your question, because it shows us that there actually was a very different, or maybe not a very different perception of Mexico, but the perception of Mexico seemed to encompass this promise of freedom in a way that has been erased since then in really interesting ways, and connects to Graham's question about, like, why do we overlook this now? So thank you.
I defer to my student.
Excellent.
So seeing as, like, you know, you mentioned the group of, like, black Seminoles who went into Texas to free, like, the wrongfully imprisoned slaves that were, or former slaves that were kidnapped, were there any instances of, like, black Seminole groups or even, like, Mexican forces or, like, militias kind of fighting the South in support of the North in their fight to abolish slavery in the Civil War?
Oh, that is very, that's a really interesting question. So there's a historian named Jerry Thompson who has written about Tejanos in Texas who joined the Union and the Confederacy and the various reasons why they were doing that. Were there black Seminoles or other Mexican, and there were Mexicans who joined both the Union and the Confederate armies, although I should know more about that. I think there's more research to be done there. I don't know of any black Seminole joining, but I'll sort of twist the question a little bit. In the midst of the US Civil War, the French army invaded Mexico and installed an emperor who is an Austrian archduke named Maximilian. This is, for those of you who celebrate Cinco de Mayo, this is about a battle that Mexico won against France in the midst of this intervention. So if you didn't know what you were celebrating, now you know. And in that controversy between the rightfully elected Mexican president, Benito Juarez, and the Emperor Maximilian, there were people from the United States who went to Mexico to try to fight on the part of Juarez. And we know that there were African Americans who had fought in the Civil War who then came to fight for Juarez against the Emperor Maximilian. So I know that there is that movement that way, and it's a great research question that I think someone maybe you should look into more, whether there were, to what extent there were Mexicans, and maybe if there were some Black Seminole who joined the military. So thank you.
Hi, Rosa. Short here. Is there a particular part of the book that was especially hard to write?
Oh,
and which part was the easiest?
Yeah. Well, I would say the whole book was really hard to write, but I would say the hardest thing to write was the introduction and the first chapter. For those of you who are students or professors, it always seems like the beginning is the hardest and requires the most amount of revision. And I think that was so hard because one of the things that was challenging about this book is that it was about US politics, Mexican politics, the experience of enslaved people. There's a lot going on there, and to sort of get everyone up to speed about US politics, Mexican politics, really hard. These are all really complicated histories. And so figuring out a way to get everyone on the same page, to understand the context without writing a whole textbook that you had to read in advance, really had a hard time with that. But yeah, thank you for that question. It's the only thing I ever knew I wanted to do was write books, and I did not understand how hard it was going to be. I knew it was going to be hard, but it was a lot harder than I thought. But also very gratifying to then be able to come and share all of this with you guys.